It was the faintest hint of something off that first rattled Christina's alarm bells. Not a sound, not a look, but the metallic perfume drifting from James's handmade coffee. That strange scent took her back to every hospital visit she'd endured, the feigned smiles, the hushed conversations, and the chill that had settled in her bones. Today, as she sat at her sister-in-law Nina's elegant dining table, she sensed the invisible trap snapping into place, and she'd only just begun to fight back. My name is Christina Bennett, and I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who had to second-guess every sip of coffee placed in front of her. I'm 29 years old, a marketing strategist in Nashville, and for most of my life, I believed in family loyalty and love. 3 years ago, when I married James, I thought I was walking into a future filled with trust and partnership. But what no one tells you is that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. It often comes from the people sitting closest to you at the dinner table. Over the last year, I've found myself battling unexplained illnesses, subtle humiliations, and a gnawing suspicion that I was no longer safe in my own marriage. At first, I dismissed it as stress, maybe even paranoia. Yet deep down, my instincts whispered something darker. What if the people I trusted most were quietly plotting against me? That's the question that haunts me every time I see James's smile not quite reach his eyes, or when my sister-in-law Nina insists on preparing my plate with just a little extra seasoning. Today, as I sit at her polished dining table, staring at a steaming cup of coffee that smells like metal, and fear I realize this story is no longer about suspicion. It's about survival. The sunlight filtered in through Nina's wide kitchen windows, casting soft golden streaks across the polished oak dining table. The room smelled faintly of lavender polish and roasted ham, a cozy scene carefully arranged to look welcoming. But my attention wasn't on the flowers or the brunch spread. It was on the coffee cup sitting in front of me. At first glance, it looked harmless cream porcelain with a faint floral rim. But the smell, it wasn't the warm, earthy fragrance that usually made my mornings bearable. It carried something different, something sharp, like rust on old pennies, or the metallic tang of blood when you bite your lip too hard. James, my husband of 3 years, placed it there with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Don't you want to try the coffee I made, especially for you, honey?" The words rolled off his tongue, as if rehearsed, smooth and casual. But I knew him well enough to notice the twitch of nerves in his jaw. I had seen that twitch before at the hospital, when the doctor couldn't explain why my body had collapsed after sipping tea at Nina's last month. James had been there holding my hand, telling everyone maybe I'd eaten something spoiled. He said it with such conviction that even I almost believed him. Almost. Now here we were again, another family brunch, another warm Sunday in Nashville, and another cup of something I didn't trust. I've learned that the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. My stomach tightened before I even touched the rim. My palms grew slick, and a faint pulse beat against my throat. 3 years of marriage had trained me to ignore small alarms, and upset stomach dizziness, the bad flu James said I caught after dinners at Nina's. But repetition is the cruel teacher of truth. I pressed a smile to my lips anyway, careful not to let it falter. "How thoughtful of you," I said softly, wrapping my fingers around the cup without raising it. Inside, my thoughts spiraled. Thoughtful? Is that what this is? Or is it calculated, carefully brewed, perfectly timed? How many times does it take before coincidence stops being coincidence? I wanted to push the cup away, but I didn't. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I let it sit there, letting the steam curl upward into my face like a warning. Boom. Across the table, Nina stirred her own coffee absent-mindedly, the silver spoon clinking against porcelain in a rhythm too steady to be casual. She hadn't touched her cup. Her eyes, hazel calculating, watched me as if she could will me into drinking. "James has become quite the barista lately," she said with a smirk. "He's been practicing different brewing methods just for you." The way she emphasized "for you" sent a shiver crawling up my spine. Her voice carried a sweetness dipped in acid. It wasn't a compliment. It was a threat wrapped in velvet. I studied her, pretending to glance around the room. Nina had always been perfect in presentation: polished nails, a wardrobe curated from glossy catalogs, and a smile designed to disarm. But beneath the surface, I had seen flashes, subtle slips, like when she accidentally spilled wine on my dress at a client dinner, or when the soup she served me tasted slightly different than everyone else's. Each incident left me sick, humiliated, or both. And always Nina was there with an innocent smile and an apology too smooth to believe. Now she sat there waiting, spoon in hand, as if savoring the anticipation of me taking that first sip. It wasn't always this way. When I first met James at a wedding downtown, he was charming, thoughtful, with little details, attentive in ways that made me feel seen. He remembered my favorite songs, texted me goodnight, and told me stories about wanting to build a life built on love and trust. I fell for him quickly, maybe too quickly. Nina back then seemed welcoming too. She helped plan our wedding, picked out the flowers, even cried during our vows. I thought she was happy to have me as part of the family. But now, 3 years later, I looked at her across the table and wondered if those tears had been for joy or envy. The metallic odor rose again, stronger this time, or maybe my mind magnified it. I lifted the cup slightly, pretending to take a sip. The ceramic touched my lip, and I froze. James and Nina exchanged a glance, quick, fleeting, but enough. Enough to confirm that my instincts weren't paranoia. I lowered the cup carefully, setting it back down as if nothing had happened. My inner voice whispered sharp and clear, "They want you sick. They want you gone, but not today." I reached for my phone, pretending to check a message. "Oh, would you look at that? I need to make a quick call for work. Nina, do you mind if I use your study?" I rose, balancing the phone in one hand and the cup in the other. As I passed Nina's place setting, I deliberately stumbled, just clumsy enough to be believable. In that half second of chaos, the cups switched. Her coffee for mine, mine for hers. I gasped and straightened up quickly. "I'm so sorry, Nina. I'm such a klutz sometimes." She waved me off with a tight smile. "Just try not to break anything in the study." Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed annoyance. My heart hammered in my chest. I'd done it. The trap was set. From the study's doorway, I angled myself just enough to see back into the dining room. James scrolled on his phone, pretending to be distracted. Nina, still talking idly, lifted the coffee cup to her lips. Every nerve in my body screamed. My throat tightened, my stomach clenched, my legs locked in place. Part of me wanted to rush forward, to grab the cup from her hands, to scream, "Don't do it." But another part, colder and sharper, held me still. I needed to know. I needed proof. Too many nights doubled over in pain. Too many ER visits explained away as bad luck. This was the moment. Nina sipped. My breath caught. What if I'm wrong? What if this is just coffee bitter from the roast? What if paranoia has turned me into the villain in my own story? But then I remembered the IV drip, the hospital beeps, the taste of bile in my throat after her special tea. The way James held my hand, whispering excuses, soothing lies. No, I wasn't wrong. This was my truth, whether anyone else wanted to see it or not. I leaned against the doorframe, the phone in my hand, quietly recording, and waited for the consequences of my choice. Nina lifted the cup with a grace that looked almost rehearsed, her manicured fingers curling delicately around the porcelain handle. She spoke about something trivial, renovations at her office, a new client she was courting, but her voice was faint in my ears. All I could focus on was the way the cup tilted, the way the dark liquid brushed the rim, and the way her lips finally met it. She sipped. Just a small taste, and my entire world froze. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. My pulse thundered in my ears. The room seemed too still, too normal. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe I had just set in motion the cruelest trick of all, exposing myself as paranoid, vindictive, suspicious of the people closest to me. But then, subtle at first, it came. A slight tremor in Nina's hand as she set the cup back down. Her polished smile faltered ever so slightly, as if a shadow crossed her face. She cleared her throat, forcing a laugh, but her voice cracked. I gripped the doorframe tighter. "It's happening." Her eyes flickered to James. For once, the control in her gaze slipped, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. James looked up from his phone, registering her shift in posture. The moment he realized what had happened, his expression changed so suddenly, it was like watching a mask rip in half. Confusion, then horror, then the dawning recognition that his carefully laid plan had backfired. "Nina, what's wrong?" His chair screeched back as he jumped to his feet. The fear in his voice was raw, stripped of its usual calm facade. I clutched my phone, recording every second. There it is, I thought. The truth doesn't need words. It leaks out in the face, in the panic, in the slips no one can control. But as I watched Nina's hand tremble harder as her knuckles whitened against the table edge, I felt something unexpected. Guilt. A whisper in my chest asked, what if she dies? I hadn't poisoned her. I hadn't brewed that metallic coffee, but I had let her drink it. I had made the choice to stand still. I thought about every sleepless night doubled over in pain, every IV needle piercing my arm, every humiliating moment explained away as me being weak. And I reminded myself, this isn't vengeance. This is survival. Still, guilt gnawed at the edges of my resolve, sharp and merciless. Her breathing grew ragged, shallow gasps between clenched teeth. Her perfectly styled hair clung to the side of her face as beads of sweat broke across her skin. She tried to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her. "James!" She rasped, her voice breaking. "Something's wrong!" James lunged toward her, knocking over his chair in his rush. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup," he whispered, panicked. The words were meant for her, but they rang across the room like a gunshot. Confirmation. Clear, undeniable, irreversible. I stepped farther into the doorway, the phone still recording. My heart was a drumbeat of adrenaline and terror. Part of me wanted to rush to Nina's side to play the role of concerned sister-in-law, to call it an accident. But another voice inside me, colder and stronger, held me back. No. You've spent years being gaslit, dismissed, almost destroyed. This is the truth revealing itself. Don't steal it back from them. Don't cover their tracks. My breathing slowed. For the first time in years, I felt steady, not spinning. Watching Nina falter, hearing James's slip, it was as though the fog of self-doubt finally cleared. Nina's voice cut through, strained and furious even in her weakness. "James, what did you put in it?" You said it would only make her sick. Her words hit me like a knife. Not only was she complicit, she was aware. Fully, deliberately aware. James stammered, his face ashen. I didn't mean, not like this. Just enough to stop her from going to that meeting. I felt bile rise in my throat. So, it had been about business, about contracts, about my work, my success threatening their fragile pride. They wanted to discredit me, weaken me, keep me sidelined. But as I watched Nina's body betray her, I realized it had grown beyond sabotage. It had become something far darker. I thought about how betrayal doesn't come with warning signs or flashing lights. It comes in small, intimate acts. A cup of coffee, a hand that steadies your shoulder, a smile that hides a blade. The greatest threats often aren't strangers in alleys. They're the people who share your dinner table. I let the truth of that thought settle in my bones. This was betrayal layered deep, not just by my husband, but by the woman who had pretended to welcome me into her family. As Nina collapsed against James, her body trembling with spasms, she couldn't control the coffee cup rolled across the table and clattered to the floor. The sound was loud, final, like the gavel of a judge striking down a verdict. In that moment, everything I had endured suddenly had context. The metallic taste in my throat at the hospital, the dizzy spells, the unexplained reactions, all threads weaving into a pattern I could no longer deny. My body had known the truth long before my mind dared to believe it. I stepped into the room fully, now my phone raised slightly, capturing James's frantic attempts to keep Nina upright. He looked up at me, eyes wild with fear. Christina, it's not what you think. But the irony was, for the first time, I knew exactly what it was. Ah. As the sirens in the distance began to wail, neighbors must have heard the commotion. I realized the story had shifted. No longer was I the fragile wife doubting her instincts. No longer was I the woman gaslit into silence. I was the witness, the survivor, the one who had caught them in their own trap. And that cup of coffee, the simplest object on the table, had become the most powerful evidence of all. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't line up neatly in order. It spills out in fragments, moments stitched together by fear and recognition. Sometimes it takes just one smell, one taste, to pull you back to the place you swore you'd moved past. For me, that metallic tang of James's coffee dragged me through 3 years of memories I'd tried so hard to bury. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of small incidents that at first seemed like bad luck, food allergies, or simple stress. But when you lay them out side by side, they stop looking random. They start to look like a pattern. And patterns don't lie. It was February, just 6 months into my marriage. Nina had invited us for dinner, insisting she wanted to celebrate James's recent promotion. She served roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans with almonds, a classic Southern spread, warm and inviting. I remember feeling grateful, newly married, adjusting to James's family dynamics, still trying to fit into their rhythm. Nina was all smiles that night, refilling my wine glass, offering me seconds. I thought she was being kind. But an hour after dinner, my stomach began to twist. It wasn't normal indigestion. It was violent, cramping waves that doubled me over. By midnight, I was curled up on the bathroom floor, shivering, drenched in sweat, vomiting until my throat burned raw. James sat outside the door, his voice muffled. "It must have been something you ate at work earlier, honey. You're always forgetting lunch and snacking on whatever's around. That's probably what did it." I wanted to believe him. After all, how could I suspect his sister? How could I doubt the family that welcomed me? I clung to his explanation because it was easier than facing the unease gnawing at me. But deep down, even in my fever haze, I remembered one thing: Nina hadn't eaten the chicken. She'd pushed it around her plate, claiming she was watching her carbs. Everyone else ate it, but mine had tasted slightly different, saltier, almost bitter in places. I brushed it off, told myself I was being paranoid. Two months later, in April, I found myself back at Nina's house. She'd invited me for an afternoon tea, just the two of us, while James worked late. She said she wanted to bond sister to sister. I wanted that closeness. Part of me still hoped Nina liked me, that we could have the kind of relationship other women bragged about, the built-in best friend when you marry into a family. She brewed a pot of chamomile tea, poured it into delicate china cups. I remember admiring the set white porcelain with tiny blue flowers, probably an heirloom. She slid one cup toward me with that perfectly polished smile. The first sip was sweet honey-laced, but halfway through, something shifted. My vision blurred, the room tilted, and my hands trembled so hard I nearly dropped the cup. "Are you okay?" Nina asked, her tone casual, not alarmed. I tried to speak, but my tongue felt heavy. My body sagged into the chair, dizziness pulling me under like a riptide. When I woke up hours later, James was beside me in our bedroom, worry painted on his face. "You've been working too hard, babe. Stress will do that. Nina said you fainted. Maybe you just stood up too fast after drinking the tea?" I wanted to protest, to say it wasn't that. But what proof did I have? A faint memory of bitterness at the bottom of the cup? A sister-in-law smiling as I slipped under? It sounded crazy even to me. So I stayed quiet. Told myself maybe he was right. Maybe it was stress. But I couldn't ignore the chill that settled in me every time I thought of Nina's face, leaning over me. Her eyes calm, detached, almost studying me. Just. By June, I had learned to be cautious, but still hadn't let myself name the fear. James and I had stayed the night at Nina's after a late family gathering. The next morning, she cooked breakfast: scrambled eggs, bacon toast. The eggs on my plate looked a shade darker than the other, small, almost imperceptible, but I noticed. Still, I ate. I didn't want to be rude. Half an hour later, I was on the floor of the guest bathroom, my body rebelling violently. Vomiting chills, skin clammy and pale. I couldn't stand upright without my knees buckling. James carried me to the car and drove me to urgent care. The doctor hooked me up to an IV, pumped fluids into me, and ran tests. The results came back inconclusive, something foreign in my system, but nothing they could identify. James explained it away like always. She probably took expired vitamins. She's always forgetting to check the labels. I didn't argue. My body was too weak, my voice too thin. But lying in that hospital bed, I replayed the morning in my mind. The way Nina had hovered watching me eat. The way she didn't finish her own plate. The faint curl of satisfaction at the corner of her mouth when I said I wasn't feeling well. That time, it lasted for days. My body wouldn't bounce back. I had to miss a major client meeting, one I'd spent weeks preparing for. Nina kindly offered to cover some of my work while I recovered. It was the first time I suspected this wasn't just about me being unlucky. What strikes me most, now looking back, isn't just the sickness. It's the way James always had an answer ready. He played the perfect husband, soothing, logical, convincing not only me, but everyone around us. "You're just sensitive. You must have eaten something else. You really should take better care of yourself." Each phrase was like a nail in the coffin of my confidence. Little by little, I started to believe maybe it was me. Maybe I was fragile, clumsy, accident-prone. Maybe I couldn't trust my own body. That's what gaslighting does. It erodes you from the inside, makes you question reality until you can't tell where the truth ends and the lies begin. And Nina, always hovering with her practiced innocence, made it easy for him. But bodies remember. Instinct remembers. Each time I walked into their house, something in me tensed. A small voice whispered, "Be careful." I ignored it again and again until the memories piled high enough to crush denial. The dinner, the tea, the breakfast. 3 strikes. 3 trips to doctors who couldn't explain. 3 times James smoothed it over, and 3 times Nina smiled like nothing was wrong. That's not coincidence. That's sabotage. Nights were the worst. When the lights dimmed and the house fell silent, I'd lie awake next to James, staring at the ceiling. My body would still ache from the latest incident, my stomach tender, my veins cold from the IV. And that's when the questions came. What if he's right? What if I am just fragile? I'd replay every doctor's visit in my head. The shrugging shoulders, the furrowed brows, the inconclusive lab results. The doctors couldn't find anything concrete, so maybe it really was me. Maybe I was just broken in ways no test could measure. James always seemed so calm, so rational. He stroked my hair, told me I worried too much, promised everything would be fine if I just rested. His voice was like a blanket, wrapping me in comfort, but also smothering my doubts, pressing them down until I barely trusted my own instincts. That's the cruelty of gaslighting. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It reshapes your thoughts until you think the cage you're in was always meant to protect you. I couldn't talk to friends about it. How could I? What would I say? My sister-in-law might be poisoning me, but I can't prove it. My husband always has an excuse, and maybe he's right. Maybe I'm just sickly. They would look at me with pity or worse, skepticism, and so I stayed silent. I wore a smile at brunches, nodded through family gatherings, played the part of the grateful wife. Inside, though, the isolation grew. I started journaling, scribbling down each incident with dates and details. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was the only thing tethering me to reality. When James told me I was imagining things, I'd reread my notes and remind myself, this happened. I'm not crazy. The more I thought back, the more I noticed Nina's mastery of innocence. She never overplayed it. She didn't gasp dramatically or fawn over me when I got sick. She simply expressed just enough concern to appear genuine. "Are you okay? Can I get you some water?" While her eyes stayed cool, detached. Looking back, it was like she was studying me, watching how quickly the symptoms came, on how long they lasted, what the doctor said afterward. Like I was part of an experiment she wanted to perfect. That realization haunts me still. To her, I wasn't family. I wasn't even a rival. I was a subject, a test case in her private lab of cruelty. For a long time, I told myself I couldn't be sure. That suspicion wasn't the same as truth. But memories don't fade when they carry pain. I remembered the dinner, how her fork never touched the chicken. I remembered the tea, her steady gaze as my vision blurred. I remembered the breakfast, the faint curl of satisfaction at her lips. 3 separate events, but the same pattern. The same outcome, me weak and vulnerable, and Nina untouched, calm, waiting. Coincidences can happen once, maybe twice, but 3 times is a strategy. Late one night, sitting alone in the living room, I whispered to myself just to hear the words out loud. She's doing this on purpose. The sound of my own voice startled me. Saying it made it real. I pressed my hands together, trembling. What kind of person poisons their own family? And then the darker thought came. What kind of husband lets it happen? The answer I didn't want to face was already inside me. James wasn't just oblivious. He was complicit. Maybe not at first. Maybe he told himself it was small, harmless. But by the third time, by the hospital bed, he had to know. He chose not to protect me. From then on, fear became my shadow. Every time I stepped into their home, my senses sharpened. I'd sniff food before tasting it touch the rim of glasses, as though I could feel a difference. At restaurants, I caught myself glancing at James's hands, wondering if he'd slipped something into my drink when I wasn't looking. At home, I checked expiration dates, obsessively lined up bottles in the pantry, wrote down when I opened each one. It wasn't living, it was surviving. One evening after the breakfast incident, James grew impatient. "Christina, you have to stop making everything into a crisis. You're embarrassing yourself. Nina's been nothing but kind to you." The words stung more than the sickness. They stripped away the illusion of partnership, revealing the fracture line between us. His loyalty wasn't to me, it was to Nina, to the image of family he refused to tarnish. And in that moment, the last fragment of doubt fell away. Looking back with clarity, I can see the psychology behind it. Nina's motives were rooted in envy, professional jealousy, sibling rivalry, the kind of resentment that festers in silence until it finds an outlet. James's motives were different: denial, cowardice, self-preservation. He didn't want to confront the truth because it would mean choosing between me and his sister. So he chose silence, and silence in betrayal is as deadly as action. As I sat in Nina's study doorway that day, watching her sip the poisoned coffee, those memories flooded me all at once. Not random, not scattered, woven together like a tapestry spelling out one-word sabotage. The dinner wasn't an accident. The tea wasn't stress. The breakfast wasn't bad luck. They were steps. Calculated, deliberate steps designed to weaken me, discredit me, maybe even destroy me. And now, with that single sip of metallic coffee, the truth was finally visible, not just to me, but to everyone. Memory is not just recollection, it's evidence. It's the body's way of shouting when the mind refuses to listen. My body had been screaming for 3 years, begging me to see the pattern. And as Nina's hand trembled around the cup that day, I finally understood I hadn't been paranoid. I hadn't been weak. I had been targeted. And survival meant believing myself, even when no one else did. The room was still. Too still. For one fleeting second, I wondered if I had imagined it all: the metallic scent, the secretive glances, the unease clawing at me for months. Maybe I'd overthought everything. Maybe Nina would sip the coffee, set the cup down, and smile like nothing had happened. But then it began. Nina's hand trembled as she placed the cup back onto the saucer. The delicate porcelain rattled against the plate louder than it should have been in that perfectly staged dining room. Her polished smile cracked like a mask slipping off an actor's face. I felt my breath catch. My heart hammered so violently, I thought the sound might give me away from the doorway of the study. She cleared her throat once, twice, trying to steady herself. "Excuse me?" she murmured, her voice thinner than usual, lacking its practiced confidence. But the tremor in her hand grew worse. The spoon she'd been idly stirring earlier clinked against the saucer, a sound shaky and uneven. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. I knew that feeling all too well. The weakness, the cold sweat, the sudden betrayal of your own body. I'd lived it 3 times already. But watching it happen to her was surreal, like seeing a nightmare flipped on its head. Part of me wanted to rush in to help her, to prove to myself I was still human enough to care. But another part, colder and more primal, whispered, "No. Wait. Watch. This is the proof you've needed." James looked up from his phone. At first, it was just curiosity. Then his face drained of color as he saw Nina falter. "Nina, what's wrong?" His voice pitched higher, tinged with panic. He stood so fast that his chair screeched backward across the hardwood floor, the sound harsh and grating. His eyes darted from her face to the cup on the table, then back again. And then he said it. The words that split the air open like a thunderclap. "That wasn't your cup." My stomach dropped. The confirmation I had feared and needed tumbled out of his mouth in his panic. The words hung in the air, echoing in my chest. Not your cup. So whose cup had it been mine? The moment James spoke, the room shifted. Nina's head jerked toward him, her eyes wide, filled with both realization and rage. "What do you mean?" She hissed, her voice uneven as another tremor racked her body. I tightened my grip on my phone thumb, brushing the record button. The screen glowed faintly, capturing every sound, every expression. There it was, the unraveling. The facade of normalcy, the years of careful lies, all breaking apart under the weight of one panicked mistake. I pressed myself against the doorframe, heart pounding, forcing myself to remain silent. This is it. Don't intervene. Don't save them from themselves. Let the truth speak. For so long, I doubted myself, questioned my sanity, begged for validation that never came. And now, here it was unfolding in front of me. Proof raw and undeniable. Still, guilt gnawed at me. My hands trembled. If she dies, am I responsible? Am I any better than them if I stand here and do nothing? But then I remembered the nights I'd lain in hospital beds, the doctors shaking their heads, James whispering excuses into my ear. I remembered Nina's faint smirk as I doubled over in pain. No, this wasn't revenge. This was revelation. Nina clutched her stomach, her face pale, sweat beading at her temples. "James," she gasped. "What did you put in it? You said it would just make her sick, not?" Her words faltered into a groan, but the meaning was clear. My heart lurched. Even in her pain, she couldn't keep her secrets. The truth was spilling out unfiltered, because survival has a way of stripping people bare. James knelt beside her, his hands fumbling uselessly. It wasn't supposed to be like this, just enough to keep her home to. He stopped abruptly, eyes darting toward the study, as if sensing my presence. I stayed still, breath shallow, letting the phone do its work. Every word, every slip was being captured. Later, as I'd reflect on this moment, I'd understand the psychology behind it. People can maintain facades for months, even years, but under stress, the kind of stress where life and death hang in the balance, the mask slips. Their real motives, their hidden alliances come spilling out. That's what I was witnessing. James and Nina weren't villains out of a novel. They were human, flawed, unraveling under the pressure of their own schemes. And that made it all the more terrifying. Nina tried to push herself upright, but her hand knocked the cup to the floor. It shattered shards, scattering across the hardwood, the dark liquid pooling like spilled ink. The sound rang in my ears like a gavel striking wood final and absolute. A verdict rendered. I flinched, my body reacting as if it had been my own cup breaking. Maybe in a way it was. That cup had been meant for me. I thought of all the times I'd been dismissed. It's stress. It's food poisoning. You're just sensitive. Every excuse replayed in my mind like a cruel refrain. And yet here she was, Nina, the orchestrator of so many of my illnesses, writhing in the very trap she'd laid for me. There was no denying it now. No rationalization James could spin. The truth had bared itself in the most undeniable way through their own words, their own mistakes. As Nina's groans filled the room and James's frantic whispers tried to patch together a crumbling lie, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak. I wasn't imagining things. For the first time in years, I felt sane, and I knew this was only the beginning. Nina slumped sideways in her chair, her fingers clawing at the tablecloth, as if she could hold onto something solid while her body betrayed her. The tremors coursing through her limbs grew violent, her breath shallow and ragged. James hovered over her useless hands, fluttering, his voice rising with panic. "Nina, stay with me. You're okay. Just breathe. Please, just breathe." But his words sounded hollow, desperate, a man scrambling to rewrite a story that had already been written. I couldn't stay hidden any longer. The weight of the moment pressed me forward, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood as I entered the dining room. The phone in my hand was still recording, the faint red light blinking like a silent witness. James's head snapped up. His eyes widened, fear flashing across his face, not for Nina, but for himself. "Christina!" I held his gaze, my voice steady, in a way that surprised even me. "Go on, James. Keep talking. The camera's listening." The room fell silent, broken only by Nina's ragged gasps. James's mouth opened, then closed, like a fish caught on land. He looked from me to Nina, back to me again, trapped between lies he could no longer sustain. Nina's eyes, glassy with pain, locked onto mine. For once, there was no calculation, no polished facade, just raw fear. "You switched them," she rasped, her voice laced with both disbelief and fury. I didn't flinch. "Yes, and now we all know." Later, I would think about this moment, the psychology of it. How quickly a carefully constructed persona collapses under exposure. It doesn't take years of investigation or an army of lawyers. Sometimes all it takes is one mistake. One sentence blurted in panic. One sip from the wrong cup. James and Nina had built a fortress of lies around me. Gaslighting, manipulation, excuses layered so thick I nearly drowned in them. But the thing about fortresses is that once a crack forms, the whole structure buckles. This was their crack, and I was watching it splinter wide open. James stumbled toward me, hands raised as if in surrender. "Christina, listen to me. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We just needed you to slow down. You've been working yourself to death taking all the big clients." And I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "By poisoning me, by putting me in the hospital 3 times. That's your idea of helping me slow down." His face crumpled, shame and panic warring across his features. "No, not like that. We never wanted." But the words fell apart, because how do you defend the indefensible? Nina groaned, clutching her stomach, but forced words through clenched teeth. "This is your fault, James. You said it would just be enough to keep her home. You promised." Her voice cracked, but the damage was done. The air in the room thickened with her admission. My phone caught every syllable, every ragged breath. I stepped closer, my tone calm, almost clinical. So it wasn't an accident. It was never an accident. Nina's eyes darted toward me, filled with hatred, even as pain racked her body. You don't understand. You take everything, every client, every deal. You don't deserve. She broke off, coughing, her strength fading. Her words sliced deep. Because buried in them was the truth I had avoided. This wasn't just about family tension. This was about power, work, success. Nina's envy wasn't limited to personal dislike. It was professional, all-consuming. And James, he had gone along with it. Maybe out of loyalty, maybe out of fear, maybe out of his own insecurity. But the why didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the truth spilling out before me. I raised my phone slightly, making sure they both saw it. Everything you're saying right now, it's being recorded. Every word, every excuse. James froze. His shoulders slumped as though the last bit of fight had drained from him. "Christina, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We can fix this. No one else has to know." I stared at him, almost pitying the desperation in his eyes. "Almost. Everyone will know. Because for once, I have the proof you can't twist." Nina let out a low, guttural moan, her body convulsing. James scrambled back to her side, fumbling for his phone, shouting something about calling an ambulance. I dialed, first my voice steady as I gave the dispatcher the address, my tone clinical, detached. "My sister-in-law has ingested something toxic. She's conscious, but seizing. Please send help immediately." The dispatcher's calm responses contrasted with the chaos around me. I repeated details, each word a nail in the coffin of their scheme. All the while, my phone in the other hand continued recording, capturing James's frantic mutterings, Nina's desperate gasps, the undeniable reality of their plan collapsing. As the wail of sirens drew closer, I felt something shift inside me. Not joy, not yet. Not relief either, but a calm certainty. For 3 years, I had been dismissed, doubted, made to question my own sanity. And now, in this moment of chaos, I felt grounded for the first time. The truth wasn't just mine anymore. It was in the open, undeniable. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, they had worked to make me sick, to weaken me, to make me doubt myself. But in the end, their own trap became their undoing. The truth didn't come from doctors or detectives. It didn't come from tests or evidence in sterile labs. It came from them, panicked, unraveling, caught in their own lies. And as the paramedics burst through the front door, I knew this was the first true climax of the story. The moment where everything changed. The sirens grew louder, swelling like an oncoming storm, until red and blue lights splashed against the windows of Nina's pristine suburban home. Paramedics burst through the door, their movements brisk and efficient, but the room still felt suspended in a terrible stillness. James stammered explanations. Nina groaned incoherently on the floor, and I stood there, phone in hand, a silent recorder of truth. For years, I had been the one trembling, the one helpless in hospital beds, the one who couldn't explain what was happening to her body. But now the roles had shifted, and though adrenaline still coursed through me, a strange calm rooted itself inside. For the first time, I wasn't the victim of chaos. I was the witness. The emergency room at Nashville General buzzed with the familiar urgency of controlled crisis. Nurses wheeled Nina past the triage desk, her body convulsing, IV lines already being prepared. James trailed behind like a shadow, unraveling his shoulders, hunched his lips, moving in panicked prayers that I didn't believe. I followed at a steady pace, my phone clutched so tightly my knuckles blanched white. This device, the very one I once used to scroll mindlessly through social media, was now my lifeline. Inside it were the words, the confessions, the cracks in their mask that I had captured. A nurse turned to me. Family of the patient. James opened his mouth, but I cut in before he could twist reality once more. I'm her sister-in-law, and I have information you're going to need. My voice didn't shake. That in itself felt like a miracle. In a small consultation room off the ER corridor, I sat across from Dr. Phillips, a tall woman with sharp eyes and streaks of silver in her hair. She listened carefully as I explained. Not just with polite nods, but with real focus, like someone who understood the weight of hidden truths. I set my phone on the table and pressed play. James's panicked voice filled the room. That wasn't your cup. Nina's ragged accusation followed. You said it would just make her sick. The doctor's expression shifted from concern to alarm to something colder, recognition. This is very serious, she said, scribbling notes on her tablet. The toxicology screen already showed substances in her system that shouldn't be there. But this confirms intent. Intent. The word landed like a gavel. I sat back, my body trembling in delayed reaction. Intent. For months, I had told myself maybe it was bad luck, maybe stress, maybe my body betraying me. To hear a doctor and authority say it out loud stripped away the last remnants of denial. They wanted to hurt me. Deliberately, repeatedly. I pressed my palms together in my lap to keep from breaking. Because if I allowed myself to truly feel the depth of that betrayal, I wasn't sure I'd stop crying. Detective Mendoza arrived an hour later, her presence commanding even in the sterile, fluorescent light of the hospital corridor. She specialized in domestic cases, she explained, and she'd seen things like this before. Not exactly the same, but close enough that my story didn't sound outlandish to her. I replayed the recording again this time for her. She didn't flinch, didn't interrupt. Just wrote methodical every word, every timestamp. You've been hospitalized before, she asked. I nodded. 3 times in 6 months. Always after meals with them. I pulled out a worn notebook from my purse, the journal I'd kept in secret, each entry, a lifeline to my sanity. Dates, symptoms, what I'd eaten, how long it took before I collapsed. The detective flipped through the pages slowly, her brow furrowing. You've been keeping records. I had to, I said softly. Otherwise, I'd start believing their excuses. Her eyes softened just slightly. You did the right thing. When Dr. Phillips returned, her expression was grave. We found compounds in Nina's blood that don't occur naturally. They're used in pharmaceutical testing, not something you'd ever find in a home kitchen. Someone deliberately introduced them. The room spun faintly around me, but I stayed upright, because I had expected this. Deep down, I already knew. James, who had been pacing near the window, turned sharply. That's ridiculous. She must have eaten something. Dr. Phillips's voice cut through him like steel. No, this wasn't accidental ingestion. This was contamination. James's mouth opened, then closed. For once, he had no ready excuse. Detective Mendoza leaned forward. We'll need to search both your home and James's office. Substances like this aren't easy to come by. And she was right. By the end of that day, officers had retrieved small glass bottles from James's desk at the Anderson marketing firm. Each one labeled measured with notes in his handwriting, dosages, reactions. A grotesque experiment diary. When the detective laid the evidence out on the hospital table in clear plastic bags, my stomach turned. James looked pale, his eyes darting wildly. It wasn't those weren't for. But Nina's hoarse voice from the hospital bed cut him off. You told me it would just keep her down for a while. You promised it wouldn't be traced. Hearing her words twisted something inside me. Anger, yes, but also a hollow ache. Because beneath the venom of her confession was something more pitiful envy. Nina had always hated how I outperformed her. Every client I landed, every presentation I nailed, was another thorn in her pride. But to think she'd turned jealousy into poison, it staggered me. And James. His excuse was even worse. He told the police he just wanted me to rest. Rest. 3 hospitalizations, weeks of lost health, sleepless nights with IV drips in my veins, and he called it rest. I wanted to laugh, but the sound would have been too close to a scream. That's when I understood something about human psychology, about moral disengagement. People rarely see themselves as villains. They twist their own narratives to justify cruelty. James told himself he was protecting me, giving me a break. Nina told herself it was business rivalry, not malice. But poison is poison no matter what story you wrap around it. And as I sat there listening to their excuses unravel under the weight of evidence, I realized this was bigger than betrayal. This was about survival, not just mine, but of the truth itself. The evidence table looked surreal. Clear plastic bags lined up neatly, small glass bottles with labels, dosage notes scrawled in James's familiar handwriting, and a collection of text message printouts. Words that once hid behind the glow of his phone now sat in black and white, undeniable. I leaned forward, scanning the notes. My stomach twisted when I recognized dates that matched my own journal entries. Each spike of illness, each trip to the ER here, it was mirrored in James's careful records, like some grotesque lab experiment. I swallowed hard. He had been tracking me, watching my pain like a scientist charting data, my suffering reduced to dosages and outcomes. The hospital provided a side office for the detectives to conduct initial questioning. James sat hunched in a chair, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him, his once pristine shirt wrinkled and damp with sweat. Nina lay in a hospital bed, nearby V-lines snaking into her arm, her face pale, but eyes sharp as ever. Detective Mendoza stood at the front of the room, calm and deliberate. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Anderson, we have enough evidence to proceed, but I want to hear it from you. James spoke first, his voice hoarse. It wasn't what it looks like. I just wanted Christina to slow down. She was burning herself out. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't eating. I cut him off, my voice sharper than glass. So your solution was poison, not a conversation, not support, not therapy. Poison. He winced, eyes darting to me, then to the detective, as if hoping someone would save him from the weight of my words. Look, he said desperately. I never wanted to hurt you. Not seriously. Just enough to make you take time off. Nina said it would work. She said I slammed my palm against the table, startling even myself with the sound. Nina said, do you even hear yourself, James? You've been my husband for 3 years, and all you've done is carry out your sister's jealousy like a loyal dog. The words were cruel, but I didn't regret them. He deserved to feel the sting of every betrayal he'd dismissed as stress or food poisoning. Nina shifted against her pillows, her voice raspy but laced with venom. Don't act like you're innocent, Christina. You waltzed into this family and stole everything. Clients' contracts, attention, everything that should have been mine. I stared at her, stunned by the rawness of her admission. Stole, I worked for those clients, Nina. I prepared for those presentations. I stayed up nights perfecting my proposals while you coasted on entitlement. Her lips curled into a bitter smile. And everyone loved you for it, the golden girl. I was sick of being compared. So yes, I wanted to bring you down a notch. Her honesty twisted as it was chilled me more than any lie ever had. I looked at her lying there, tubes in her arms, face contorted in pain, and wondered how envy could rot someone so thoroughly. This is what jealousy does. It warps, it corrodes, until hurting someone else feels like victory. And James? His excuse of wanting me to rest was even more insidious, because it wrapped cruelty in the disguise of care, poison masquerading as love. They both needed a narrative to protect themselves. One called it rivalry, the other called it protection. Neither wanted to admit the truth. It was malice. Plain and simple. Detective Mendoza's voice cut through the thick tension. Let me be clear, what you both did wasn't harmless. The substances we found could have been lethal. Intent doesn't need to be murder to still be criminal. She turned to me. Mrs. Bennett, your recordings, your journal, and now this physical evidence, they paint a consistent story. You've shown remarkable foresight documenting everything. I nodded faintly, but inside my emotions churned. Remarkable foresight. No, it was desperation. It was me clinging to sanity while everyone told me I was crazy. James leaned toward me, his voice breaking. Christina, please, you know me. You know I would never really hurt you. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed in the sterile room. I thought I knew you. I thought I married someone who'd protect me. Instead, I married a man who stood by while his sister experimented on my body. His face crumpled, but I didn't stop. You knew James. Maybe not the first time. Maybe you told yourself it was nothing. But by the third hospital visit, by the endless excuses, you knew. And you chose her over me. The silence afterward was deafening. For months, I'd carried the weight of self-doubt, convinced that maybe I was fragile, maybe I was overreacting. But now, sitting across from them with evidence laid bare, the weight lifted. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. I was right. And that realization, though bittersweet, felt like oxygen filling my lungs after nearly drowning. As the detectives finalized their notes and prepared formal charges, I let my gaze linger on James and Nina one last time. They looked small now, not the towering figures who had loomed over my health, my sanity, my career. Just broken people trapped in the consequences of their own choices. This is how morality fractures, I thought. Not with villains twirling mustaches, but with siblings convincing themselves jealousy is justified. With husbands convincing themselves cruelty is care. Moral disengagement is a slippery slope, and they had slid all the way down. When I finally left the hospital that night, the cool Nashville air hit my face, and I breathed deeply for the first time in months. The city lights glittered in the distance, uncaring, eternal. I clutched my journal to my chest, the phone heavy in my pocket. They weren't just tools of survival anymore. They were proof. Proof that I wasn't weak. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that the truth always claws its way to the surface, no matter how many lies bury it. And as I walked into the night, I knew this was only the beginning of a longer battle. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid, because I had the truth. And the truth was finally mine to wield. The night after the hospital interrogation felt endless. Sleep refused to come. I lay awake in my small Nashville apartment, the one I had moved into after leaving James months earlier, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rumble of cars on the street. My mind replayed everything: Nina's convulsions, James's panicked, slipped the clatter of the cup. And then the word that haunted me: intent. The police had formally charged James and Nina with attempted poisoning by the next morning. Detective Mendoza's calm, precise voice echoed in my ears as she read the charges aloud. James had tried to protest, but his words dissolved under the weight of evidence. Nina had closed her eyes, resigned, though her jaw clenched as if she were still calculating a way out. I wasn't there when the police led them from the hospital in handcuffs, but I saw the photos later, grainy shots leaked by a local news station. James, once so polished in his tailored suits, looked small, hunched, his hair unkempt, his face drawn. Nina, normally immaculate in her designer dresses, appeared pale and diminished, in a hospital gown, the IV taped to her arm, as officers escorted her out. Seeing them like that didn't bring joy. It brought something stranger, an ache deep in my chest, tangled between sorrow and vindication. This is what betrayal looks like when stripped bare, I thought. Not glamorous, not powerful, just small, just broken. The legal process moved slowly, as it always does. Weeks stretched into months. I returned to work, though the whispers followed me. Colleagues looked at me with pity, some with curiosity, a few with skepticism. At night, alone in my apartment, I replayed the recordings over and over, not because I doubted them, but because hearing their voices admit what they had done gave me strength. Proof that I hadn't imagined it. I also went to therapy, something I had resisted for years. My therapist, a steady woman named Dr. Keene, told me gently, "Christina, this trial isn't just about legal justice. It's about reclaiming your narrative." I clung to those words. The courthouse in downtown Nashville stood tall and imposing, its columns stark against the morning sky. On the first day of trial, I walked up those steps with trembling hands, my journal clutched against my chest like a shield. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, reporters setting up, lawyers shuffling papers, the hum of anticipation. When I took my seat behind the prosecution's table, my heart thudded painfully. Then the bailiff announced, "All rise," and James and Nina were led in. James avoided my gaze. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, shoulders slumped. The man who once charmed entire boardrooms couldn't even look me in the eye. Nina, though, tried to hold her head high, but it was an act she couldn't sustain. Within minutes, I saw the cracks, the twitch of her jaw, the nervous shifting of her hands. She looked smaller, somehow diminished under the weight of the setting. I sat straighter, taking a deep breath. This is it. For years, I was the one silenced, doubted, dismissed. But now they can't twist the story. The evidence will speak. I will speak. Fear still lurked in me, but it had transformed. No longer the paralyzing fear of uncertainty. It was the sharpened fear of someone standing on the edge of truth. The prosecution began methodically. First, they played my recordings. James's panicked words filled the courtroom. "That wasn't your cup." The jurors shifted in their seats. Then Nina's rasping voice. "You said it would just make her sick." Each word landed heavy in the silent room. I watched the jurors' faces, eyes narrowing, lips pressing tight. They heard it too, the intent, the conspiracy, the unraveling. Then came the text messages blown up on large screens for all to see. Lines of conversation between James and Nina, their words laced with casual malice. "Make sure she can't present at the Henderson meeting?" just enough to knock her down. I clenched my fists under the table nails, biting into my palms. Seeing their betrayal in writing felt like being stabbed again, but it also fueled me. They can't deny this. Not anymore. Dr. Phillips testified next. Her voice was clear, authoritative as she explained the toxic compounds found in Nina's blood and how they matched the traces in my medical records. She detailed the bottles seized from James's office, the dosage notes, the escalation over time. The intent was clear, she told the jury. This wasn't accidental exposure. This was systematic. I felt tears prick my eyes, not of sadness, but of validation. For once, a professional was saying out loud what I had always known: it was deliberate. Their lawyers tried to spin it. James's attorney painted him as a misguided husband, desperate to help his overworked wife rest. Nina's lawyer claimed her client had been manipulated by her brother, that she was fragile, unstable, pressured. But the words rang hollow. The jury's eyes told me they weren't buying it. James still wouldn't look at me. He kept his head bowed, hands clasped tightly together as though praying. Nina fidgeted, her earlier composure unraveling thread by thread. And I sat tall, breathing steadily, letting the truth surround me like armor. As I listened, I realized justice wasn't only about the verdict. It was about this moment, about sitting here as my full self, no longer doubting, no longer silenced. For years, I had been trapped in a fog of manipulation. But in this courtroom, with the truth laid bare, I was free. On the morning of the second day of the trial, the Nashville sky was a cool, pale blue. Reporters crowded the steps with microphones and cameras. Someone called my name as I passed, but I kept walking, my heels clicking firmly on the stone, clutching my diary to my chest. Inside the courthouse, light poured in through the high windows. As the trial resumed, the prosecutor called Detective Mendoza. She presented a string of evidence: the recordings, the pill bottles, the text messages, the hospital records, and the statements James and Nina had made that day. James said, "We just wanted her to slow down." Nina said, "You promised you wouldn't be found." Both of them had it in mind. The defense tried to argue citing pressure makes a statement distorted. But Mendoza said firmly, pressure doesn't create a labeled pill bottle or a note in a drawer. The room fell silent. It was my turn. When I swore to tell the truth, it felt like a promise to myself. I told her about the February dinner, the strange tasting chicken. About the April tea, the spinning room. About the June breakfast, the different colored eggs, and the IV needle at the hospital. About James's smooth explanations and the diary I wrote to remember I wasn't crazy. Then I told her about the day I changed my coffee, and I pressed record. "Why are you recording?" the prosecutor asked. "Because the last 3 times I had pain without evidence. This time, I need evidence." Attorney James questioned, "Could you have stress psychological symptoms?" I looked straight at him. Psychological is very strong. It told me to trust my intuition, and the test results show why. The jury nodded. James decided to testify. He looked like a shadow of the husband I once knew. He talked about love, about wanting me to rest. The prosecutor held out the evidence bag with the bottle. "Is this how you love your wife?" James choked. "I don't know. Sometimes silence is the answer." The prosecutor closed 5 words. "That wasn't your cup." The confession was clear. This was no accident. This was a months-long conspiracy. Convict them. The defense attorneys talked in circles about a family that lost its way, but the jury was unmoved. When they returned, they read, "Guilty," for both James and Nina. No cheers, No applause, just the truth. James slumped in his chair. Nina tried to hold her head high, but her hands were shaking. A week later, the verdict was delivered. Not the maximum, but a harsh reminder: poison is never rest or competition. Outside the courtroom, the reporter asked me how I felt. Relieved, sad, and grounded, I replied. This isn't revenge. This is the truth being acknowledged. Someone asked me for advice. Write it down. Trust your body. And if you can't find someone to listen, be the first to listen to yourself. Back home, I opened my diary. The first page read, February. Dinner. Chicken tastes strange. James says stress. I turned to the last page. Today the court said what my body has been saying all along. Guilty? Not me. They. I am free to trust myself. I made a new cup of coffee, no longer a trial, just coffee. And as I took my first sip, I knew justice was more than a verdict. It was the moment I stopped arguing with my own reality. The morning of sentencing was gray and cold, the kind of Tennessee winter day where the air itself feels suspended, waiting. I stood outside the courthouse with a scarf wound around my neck, watching my breath rise like smoke. People brushed past reporters clutching notepads, lawyers with their briefcases, a few curious citizens who wanted to witness justice firsthand. When the bailiff finally called the courtroom to order, the sound echoed too loudly like a gavel before the gavel. I sat down in the familiar wooden pew, my hands folded over the journal I still carried like armor. James entered first in shackles. His suit was ill-fitting now, as if borrowed from a version of himself that no longer existed. He didn't look up, not at me, not at anyone. Nina followed her wrists, bound her once perfect posture collapsed inward. Both of them appeared smaller, like figures eroded by tide after tide of truth. The judge, a stern woman with salt and pepper hair, adjusted her glasses and began to speak. Her tone was measured, but there was no mistaking the weight in her words. This court has considered the evidence presented, the victim impact statement, and the repeated, premeditated nature of the actions taken by James Bennett and Nina Anderson. What we see here is not a single lapse of judgment, but a sustained pattern of cruelty. Her words rang in my chest. Sustained pattern. That was the part that had nearly broken me, how each incident had been explained away, dismissed, swept under the rug. The judge continued to cloak these actions as concern for a spouse's well-being, or as professional rivalry is, in fact, to deepen the betrayal. Poison by any other name remains poison. I closed my eyes just for a moment. The sentence was already justice in itself, an authority naming the deception for what it was. James Bennett, the judge said, turning her gaze on him. On the counts of attempted poisoning and conspiracy, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in state prison. You will be eligible for parole after 9. James's shoulders slumped further, as though the words themselves carried physical weight. Nina Anderson. On the same counts, you are sentenced to 10 years in state prison, with parole eligibility after 7. Nina's lips trembled, but she said nothing. The clang of the gavel reverberated through the room. That sound would stay with me not as thunder, but as clarity. As they were led away, chains clinking softly, I stared at their retreating backs. These were the people I had once thought of as family. James, the man I had married believing in his vows. Nina, the sister-in-law who once welcomed me with smiles and holiday dinners. Now they were convicts. Their reputations destroyed, their careers finished. No more clients to charm, no more boardrooms to dominate. And me, I thought. What am I now? Not a victim anymore. Not just a survivor either. Something else, someone who had walked through the fire and come out scarred. but unburned. The fallout was immediate. Newspapers ran the story for weeks. Marketing executive and sister convicted of poison plot. Their company cut all ties, contracts dissolved overnight. James's former colleagues distanced themselves, whispering about warning signs they claimed to have seen but never spoken of. Nina's friends vanished, her social media accounts deleted in disgrace. Prison wasn't their only sentence. They had lost their names, their influence, their illusions. I didn't celebrate. Because in truth, the collapse of their worlds was just the natural consequence of choices they had made. You can't build on lies forever. Eventually, the ground caves in. For me, the price was different. Freedom did not come without scars. There were nights I still woke with phantom nausea, convinced someone had slipped something into my drink. There were days I distrusted even the kindness of strangers. Betrayal like theirs doesn't leave clean wounds, it leaves echoes. But slowly, I learned to live with those echoes. I learned to name them fear, mistrust, grief. And in naming them, I weakened their grip. More than anything, I learned that betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It comes from people close enough to know your habits, your weaknesses, your trust. That's what makes it potent. That's what makes it devastating. As weeks passed, I thought about what had really happened, not just legally, but psychologically. Jealousy and ambition had twisted James and Nina. What began as rivalry, me landing contracts, me excelling in presentations, morphed into envy. And envy left unchecked metastasizes into cruelty. James told himself he was helping me. Nina told herself she was defending her career. Both of them clung to their narratives like children clutching broken toys. But in the end, those stories didn't save them. They only revealed the rot inside. Walking out of the courthouse that day, the air felt cleaner, sharper. I stood on the steps for a long moment, looking at the Nashville skyline. Cars passed, horns blared. Life moved on as if nothing monumental had just occurred. But something had. I had proof, finally, that the danger had never been in the shadows or from nameless enemies. It had been across the dinner table, in shared coffee cups, in whispered conversations at family gatherings. Sometimes the greatest danger comes from those closest to us. Mia. In the weeks following the sentencing, I found myself walking differently. Not faster, not slower, but steadier, like someone who finally trusts the ground beneath her feet. The newspapers eventually stopped calling, the headlines faded, and James and Nina became just another story in the long archive of courtroom dramas. But for me, the aftermath was personal, carved into the fabric of my days. I woke one morning and realized my first thought was not about them. It was about the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the way sunlight slid across the floorboards. That small freedom, choosing what to think about, was one of the greatest victories. Where friends reached out, some with apologies, I should have believed you sooner. Others with awkward silences, guilt heavy in their pauses. I accepted both. Betrayal doesn't just fracture one relationship. It sends tremors through an entire web of connections. At work, colleagues stopped whispering. Some even came to me privately, confessing their own battles with toxic families, manipulative partners. My story, ugly as it was, had become a mirror for others. It was strange what once isolated me, now connected me. Pain, it turns out, is fluent in every language. I didn't visit James. I couldn't. But I read a letter he sent, written in cramped handwriting on yellow paper. I still love you. I know I destroyed everything, but I swear I never wanted to kill you. I wanted to keep you close, to slow you down, to stop you from leaving me behind. I stared at those words for a long time. Love. Slow you down. Not kill. It was the same story he had told himself all along, cruelty disguised as care. Even in a cell wearing a number instead of a name, he clung to the narrative that poisoned me more than the toxins ever could. I folded the letter and locked it away. Some words are not for carrying. News from Nina came secondhand. Her health had faltered and prison anxiety gnawing at her insomnia her new companion. Her reputation in the business world was beyond repair. Part of me pitied her. Another part whispered that this was the inevitable price of envy. Envy is corrosive. It doesn't just eat away at its target, it hollows out the person who carries it. Nina's obsession with my success had destroyed not just me for a time, but ultimately herself. For me, healing was not a single moment. It was a series of small, deliberate choices. Choosing to drink coffee without sniffing it first. Choosing to answer phone calls again. Choosing to smile when a stranger held the door without suspecting an ulterior motive. Each act of trust felt fragile, but each one rebuilt a brick of my foundation. Therapy helped. Journaling helped. Speaking at community groups helped. But most of all, what helped was time and the decision to stop letting their shadows dictate the shape of my days. In therapy, we dissected what had happened. Jealousy and ambition, Dr. Keene explained, are not inherently evil. They can be sparks motivators. But when mixed with insecurity and entitlement, they curdle into something poisonous. That was Nina ambition without empathy. That was James love without boundaries. Together, they had built a twisted moral logic where hurting me felt justified. They never saw themselves as villains. Few people ever do. They saw themselves as victims of my success, martyrs to my drive. Understanding that didn't excuse them, but it did explain them. And sometimes explanation is its own kind of closure. I looked at myself differently too. For 3 years, I had seen only the cracks, hospital gowns, IV drips, the fog of doubt. Now I began to see the resilience underneath. I had endured betrayal not from strangers, but from the people closest to me. And I had not only survived, I had spoken, documented, persisted, until truth itself stood on my side. That realization gave me a strange kind of pride. Not the pride of winning, but the pride of enduring. One evening, I wrote in my journal, "Sometimes the people who sit across from you at dinner are the very ones who sharpen their knives under the table. Sometimes danger comes not in dark alleys, but in bright kitchens. But survival is not about where the threat comes from, it's about whether you trust yourself enough to see it." That to me was the lesson. Betrayal will come. Not always, not from everyone, but often enough that trusting your instincts isn't paranoia, it's wisdom. James and Nina paid their price in prison, time-lost careers, shredded reputations. Their lives became cautionary tales whispered at dinner parties and dissected in corporate gossip. My price was different: months of fear, years of self-doubt scars, invisible but heavy. But in paying it, I gained something I had never had before: absolute certainty in myself. I no longer apologized for my instincts. I no longer minimized my pain. And that was the truest liberation. It had been 1 year since the verdict. 1 year since I had sat in that heavy courtroom, heard the foreperson utter the word guilty, and felt the invisible chains around my chest loosen. Now I stood on a stage at a professional conference in downtown Nashville, looking out over a ballroom filled with rows of young professionals, their faces lit by the soft glow of chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, a scent that used to trigger me but now felt like background noise, neutral, no longer threatening. I smoothed the edge of my blazer and adjusted the microphone. My heart beat fast, but not with fear, with anticipation. Good afternoon. I began, my voice steady, carrying over the quiet murmur of the crowd. My name is Christina Bennett. A year ago, if you'd told me I'd be standing here today sharing my story with you, I wouldn't have believed you. Because a year ago, I was defined not by my achievements, not by my values, but by betrayal. Betrayal from the people I trusted most. I paused. I let the words hang. I could see the faces in the audience tighten with curiosity, some with empathy, others with the instinctive discomfort people feel when reminded that darkness doesn't always come from strangers. I won't walk you through every detail, I continued. Many of you already read the headlines. But I will tell you this: for months I doubted myself. I thought I was too sensitive, too fragile. Every time I ended up in the hospital, my husband told me it was stress. My sister-in-law told me I just had bad luck, and I almost believed them. I almost convinced myself that my body was lying. The room was silent now. Even the clink of silverware at the back had stilled. But here's what I learned, I said, my voice firming. Your body doesn't lie. Your intuition is not paranoia. It's wisdom written in the language of survival. And if you ignore it long enough, you risk losing more than time. You risk losing yourself. I stepped away from the podium, letting the microphone catch my movement. The trial destroyed 2 careers, 2 reputations. It tore a hole in my personal life, but it also did something else. It revealed me to myself. I learned that survival isn't enough. Transformation is the goal. And I decided I wasn't going to let what happened to me be the period at the end of my sentence. I was going to turn it into a beginning. Heads nodded in the audience. A young woman in the front row dabbed her eyes with a napkin. So, why am I telling you this? I asked, scanning the rows of eager faces. Because many of you will find yourselves in rooms where your voice will be doubted. You'll find yourselves across from colleagues, bosses, sometimes even family who will try to rewrite your reality. When that happens, I need you to remember one thing. Trust yourself. Trust that quiet voice that says something isn't right. It might just save you. The words vibrated through me as much as through them. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, not polite, but visceral. People stood. Some clapped with tears streaming down their cheeks, others with the kind of energy that says, "This mattered." Afterwards, as I stepped down from the stage, a group of young professionals approached. A man in his 20s, tie slightly crooked, said, "How did you stay calm?" Through all of it, I smiled, remembering the nights with trembling hands and sleepless hours. I didn't always stay calm, but I documented everything. I gathered truth when I couldn't trust memory. And I learned that composure doesn't mean never shaking. It means standing anyway. A young woman leaned forward, her voice trembling. My parents never believed me when I said my partner was controlling. Hearing you, it makes me feel less alone. I touched her arm gently. You're not alone, and you're not wrong to trust what you feel. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. As I spoke with them, I felt something shift. For years I had carried shame like a second skin, the fear that my story would only ever mark me as broken. But here in this ballroom, it became something else, an offering. A lantern I could hold up so others might find their way through their own dark. This is what rebuilding looks like, I thought. Not erasing the cracks, but filling them with gold. In the months that followed, invitations poured in to speak at universities, to sit on panels about resilience, to consult with organizations about workplace trust. I said yes more often than no, not because I craved the spotlight, but because each yes was a way of refusing silence. I began mentoring younger women in my field. I helped them prepare for client meetings, not just with strategy, but with boundaries. I told them success without self-respect isn't success at all. And every time I shared my story, the fear inside me shrank a little more. One evening, after another conference, I stood at my window overlooking the Nashville skyline. Lights flickered across the city, and for the first time in years, I felt not the weight of what had been done to me, but the strength of what I had become. I whispered into the glass, "You survived, you transformed, and now you build." And in that moment, I understood I hadn't just been spared. I had been reborn